In a tense, echoing courtroom, a respected but prejudiced judge delivers his subtle contempt before the trial even begins. The black woman at the defense table remains calm, but a single symbolic gesture hints at a deeper fight ahead. Miss Davis, the judge's voice cracked like dry wood. This court will not waste its time with baseless accusations. His tone was polite enough to fool a stranger, but the contempt was sharp enough to slice the air. The words landed with the same weight as a slammed gavel, not a verdict, but a dismissal before truth could breathe. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee, its high ceilings amplifying every cough, every shuffle of paper. The walls seemed to lean in, trapping the moment in an invisible chokehold. Judge Crawford sat high on the bench, robed in authority, his silver hair a crown of self-importance. He leaned back, steepling his fingers like a man about to deliver a sermon, one he believed only he had the right to give. The golden light from the tall windows brushed against his face, but even that warmth seemed to avoid his eyes. Across from him, Alina Davis sat at the defense table, her wrists folded neatly, her breathing steady. She wore a simple navy suit, her hair pulled back, revealing eyes that did not blink in the storm. Her stillness was not weakness. It was a quiet refusal to be dragged into the judge's theater of arrogance. "Your Honor," her lawyer began. "If I may, you may not," Judge Crawford cut in. "We have rules in this court, and today's docket is for cases with merit." The audience gallery stirred, whispers, small gasps. A woman in the back clutched her purse tighter. A man in a leather jacket shook his head. But no one spoke loudly enough to challenge him. Alina reached for the small silver locket resting against her collarbone. She pressed it once between her fingers. A simple motion, but it carried weight, like touching the handle of a weapon still sheathed. Inside that locket was a photograph no one in the room had seen, but it was her anchor dot when she finally spoke. Her voice was low but clear. "I thought justice was blind." The judge's lips curled, almost a smirk. "Justice is not here to play games, Miss Davis." She didn't flinch. Instead, she let her gaze meet his, steady as stone, before adding, "Neither am I." Somewhere in the back of the room, a door creaked open, not loudly enough to break the proceedings, but just enough for the judge to glance up. A tall, pale figure stepped inside, carrying something under his arm. The man's eyes locked on Alina. She gave the faintest nod. The judge's gavel tapped once, sharp and final. "Case dismissed." But the lawyer at Alina's side did not sit down. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up toward his head. A sudden pause, a breath caught in the air. The wig was still on. But not for long. The courtroom doors creaked open again, letting in the stale scent of dust and old wood polish. People shuffled back to their seats, murmurs quickly silenced by the sharp tap of the bailiff's hand on the wooden railing. Judge Holloway entered, robe flowing, chin raised like he was, gliding above everyone else. His eyes barely acknowledged the gallery. His gaze went straight to the defense table. "Let's be quick," he muttered, his tone more an order than an invitation. "We've wasted enough time." Kaisha sat straighter in her chair. The stiffness in her back came not from fear, but from a lifetime of standing in rooms like this, rooms where she was expected to shrink. "She didn't, Your Honor," her lawyer, Thomas Brandt, began. You would like to waste more of this court's resources." The judge interrupted, leaning forward as if to crush the words before they could grow. "I've already told you, this matter doesn't qualify for—" Kaisha's hands tightened on the edge of the table. The room was full, yet her world narrowed to the sound of the judge's dismissive voice, like the slam of 1,000 locked doors. Thomas glanced at her. His blue eyes held a question. Kaisha met them, steady. She didn't need to nod. Her stillness was an answer. Outside the large courtroom windows, The pale winter light bled through clouds, casting long shadows across the judge's bench. Dust particles danced in the air, slow and deliberate as if time itself was stalling. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and loud. "We're done here," he said, but something in Thomas's expression changed subtle, like the tightening of a bowstring before release. He straightened, closing his file with slow precision. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "before you make that final, irreversible decision, I have something to show this court." The gallery stirred. The judge looked irritated. "This isn't a performance, Mr. Brandt. Get on with it." Thomas's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile, it was the ghost of something heavier. His hand rose toward his head, fingers brushing the pristine white wig perched there. Kaisha felt her heart beat. Once, hard it had begun. The news spread like spilled ink through the veins of the courthouse. By the time the clock struck 11, every corridor, every whispering cluster of clerks and junior lawyers had heard. The white lawyer in courtroom B had removed his wig in protest. From behind his chamber's heavy oak door, Judge Harrington could hear the murmur. The sound grated against him, not because it was loud, but because it was alive, carrying an energy he hadn't anticipated. He shuffled papers deliberately, trying to remind himself who was in charge. Meanwhile, Ava sat in the waiting area outside, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked composed, but her thoughts were a storm. "He didn't have to do that for me," she told herself, yet somewhere deep a seed of hope was sprouting. Marcus's silent act wasn't just rebellion, it was acknowledgement. When the court resumed, the room felt different. The jury's eyes lingered longer, their expressions softer. Even the stenographer typed with an uncharacteristic hesitation, as if afraid to miss something important. Harrington slammed the gavel, a little too hard. "Let's proceed," he said, his tone brittle. Marcus rose, no wig, no apology. His voice was steady but carried an edge now, an unspoken warning. "Your Honor," he began, "before we continue, I'd like to request that my client's testimony be heard in full without interruption. The law, after all, promises equal standing for every citizen, does it not?" A vein pulsed in Harrington's temple. "Mr. Hiley, your client's relevance to this court is still, with respect," Marcus cut in. "Her relevance was established the moment she walked through those doors. Denying her a voice is denying the very foundation you sit upon." The air in the room tightened. A clerk in the back shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the gallery let out a barely audible "M." For the first time, Harrington looked at Ava directly. His eyes flickered, something between recognition and resistance. He adjusted his robe and cleared his throat. "This court will take a short recess," he said abruptly, banging the gavel again, but as he left the bench, his steps weren't as confident. They were measured. Marcus turned to Ava, leaning close enough for only her to hear. "Cracks in marble start small," he murmured. Ava, despite herself, allowed the ghost of a smile. The sound of those words seemed to linger longer than the gavel's echo. The door to Judge Whitmore's chambers closed with a hollow thud, muffling the clamor of the courtroom. The room was small but stifling, its walls crowded with law books and heavy leather bindings that seemed to absorb the light. A single window leaked a thread of pale daylight across the judge's desk, cutting through dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Martin stood near the far wall, his wig still perched on his head, shoulders tense as if each breath carried the weight of a decision yet to be made. Jordan sat in a leather chair across from the judge, her palms flat on her knees, refusing to let them tremble. Whitmore didn't look at her. His gaze lingered on the stack of files in front of him, tapping one impatiently. "This case," he said, his voice clipped, "is a waste of the court's time, and I have many more deserving matters to attend to." Jordan's jaw tightened. Deserving. She had heard that word thrown like a dart at her people. Her whole life, deserving of help, deserving of respect, deserving of a chance. Always determined by someone else. Martin cleared his throat softly. Your Honor, he began, his tone even, you've not yet heard any of the evidence. How can you? Whitmore's hand sliced through the air. I've been in law for 35 years. I can smell when a case is built on sentiment instead of substance. Don't waste my time. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Jordan's eyes drifted to the small framed photograph on the judge's desk. Whitmore shaking hands, with another white man in judicial robes, both smiling like they had just won something. Worth keeping from someone else. Martin's fingers brushed the edge of his wig, almost absent-mindedly, as if testing its hold. Jordan noticed the way his gaze shifted to her for a brief second, a look that carried both reassurance and something darker, something coiled. Your Honor, Martin said slowly, I believe the law is clear. If you would just, the law is... Would I say it is in this room, Counselor? Whitmore snapped, leaning back with a smirk that had too much confidence in its own permanence. Jordan could feel her pulse in her fingertips. This was the wall she had hit her entire life, brick and cold, built of arrogance and sanctioned power. But she also sensed, from the way Martin's shoulders squared, that something in him was about to shift. The judge's pen scratched against paper as he began to write something on her file. Martin's hand lingered on the wig again, this time holding it firmly. The gesture seemed small, but it made Jordan's breath catch. She didn't know what it meant yet, only that it was the first crack in the room's suffocating control, and cracks, she knew, always let something through. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final, as though each sound was meant to crush hope itself. Order in the court, Judge Whitmore said, his eyes never landing on Cynthia, as though looking directly at her would somehow legitimize her humanity. The gallery sat hushed, yet Cynthia could feel their stares, some sympathetic, others dripping with contempt. A few leaned toward one another, whispering in tones they thought were discreet. She could make out fragments. That's her? She doesn't look dangerous. Figures they'd drag this out. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and a faint tang of disinfectant. The tall windows let in pale slats of winter sunlight, dust floating lazily through them like tiny specters of truth waiting to be seen. From the second row, a young black woman in a navy blazer clutched a notebook. Her pen moved in tight, determined strokes, eyes locked on every move made at the bench. Beside her, an older man with silver hair leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, watching Whitmore as though he'd seen this theater too many times before. On the far right of the gallery, a white-haired woman sat stiffly, her handbag on her lap. Cynthia didn't recognize her, but the way the woman's gaze softened when their eyes met felt like a small bridge in an otherwise hostile river. Edward leaned toward Cynthia, his voice barely above a breath. They're already writing about this. The gallery's not just watching, they're carrying your story outside these walls. Cynthia kept her face still, her voice even lower. They'll only carry what they're allowed to hear. Act. The defense table across from them, opposing counsel smirked, tapping a pen against the desk. It was a gesture so subtle, so calculated, that it sent a shiver down Cynthia's spine. It was the kind of smirk that said, "We've already won." The whispers in the gallery swelled again, this time with sharper edges. Someone muttered, "They're burying her." Someone else, "Not if he makes his move." Edward's jaw tightened. "They think I'm waiting for permission," he said under his breath, his voice carrying a weight Cynthia hadn't heard before. The bailiff's eyes flicked toward the audience, warning them into silence, but the current had already shifted. Cynthia could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a quiet battlefield, and the first shots had already been fired in the form of glances, whispers, and the steady drip of truth leaking from one heart to another. In the back row, a young man raised his phone slightly, pretending to check the time, but Cynthia saw the camera open. She knew that someone else would see this room, not the version Judge Whitmore wanted, but the one that lived in raw light and unedited air. Edward's hand rested on a file before him. His thumb tapped once, a silent metronome. Cynthia followed his gaze not at the judge, but at the rows of faces watching, waiting, silently shifting into all eyes. The revolution wasn't loud yet, but it was there, breathing beneath the skin of the room, in the places where eyes met and refused to look away. And Cynthia, for the first time since entering that courtroom, felt the tiniest ember of something dangerous hope. The morning light streamed through the high arched windows, casting golden lines across the oak-paneled courtroom. The air was heavy, not with the damp weight of rain, but with the tense anticipation of a match in its final rounds. Yet no one here dared call it a fight, at least not openly. Judge Whitmore sat rigid in his chair, his gavel resting lazily in his right hand, like a weapon he could wield at any moment. His eyes, cold and distant, avoided Camille's entirely, lingering only on her white attorney, Peter, as though she herself were a shadow in the proceedings. Peter adjusted his spectacles, leaned forward, and said in a tone deceptively polite, "Your Honor, may I bring to the court's attention Exhibit C?" The judge's brow furrowed. "Proceed." Peter slid a folder across the polished mahogany table. The clerk picked it up, shuffled the pages, and placed them in front of Whitmore. Camille watched his hands tremble ever so slightly as he turned the first page. It was nothing dramatic, no shocking confession, no incriminating photograph, just a court transcript from 3 years ago. But Peter's voice, steady as steel, began reading aloud a ruling where Whitmore had granted a nearly identical case in favor of a white plaintiff. The parallel was undeniable. A murmur rippled through the benches. One man leaned toward his neighbor, whispering, "That's the same statute, isn't it?" Another scribbled notes hurriedly, glancing up with barely concealed interest. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Counselor," he said slowly, "we are not here to relitigate prior cases." Peter's reply was a masterstroke of restraint. "Of course not, Your Honor. We are simply here to ensure the law is applied equally as precedent requires." Camille's heart thudded. She could feel it, the faintest shift in the room's gravity. For the first time, Whitmore looked directly at her, though his eyes were not warm. They carried something else. Calculation. The clerk cleared his throat, the sound breaking the silence. "Shall I enter Exhibit C into record, Your Honor?" Whitmore paused, a fraction too long. "Enter it." The gavel came down softly, but the sound reverberated through Camille's chest. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was a crack. And she knew from the streets of her childhood that even the smallest crack in concrete could split wide open, if pressure was applied in the right place. When the recess was called, Peter leaned in. His voice was barely above a whisper. "This is where we begin, Camille, not where we end." She looked at him and nodded, her mind replaying the words like a drumbeat. Begin, not end. Because beginnings, she knew, had power. The courtroom air changes as Richard, without his wig, begins to unravel a hidden history that shocks even the judge. His words aren't just arguments. They are revelations that force everyone to confront truths they've long ignored. The black woman sits straighter, sensing that this moment could alter everything. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses on your eardrums. Richard stood at the center, the sunlight now fully bathing his bare head, the traditional white wig abandoned like an outdated lie. His eyes were locked on the judge, not with defiance, but with a dangerous kind of honesty. You want to know why I took it off? Richard's voice carried, steady but sharp. Because I refuse to wear the same costume that once presided over injustice. My client doesn't need another man pretending to be justice. She needs justice itself. The judge shifted uncomfortably, his gavel resting unused. Mr. Halston, this court, Richard cut in, has a history. Not just this room, but the system it represents. And I think it's time we all face it. Gasps rippled through the room as Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a faded leather-bound ledger. The pages were yellowed, the ink smudged with age. This is from 1926, he said, holding it up. Minutes from trials held in this very building. My grandfather was a court clerk here. The black woman's brow furrowed. She hadn't expected this. My grandfather recorded the proceedings, Richard continued, his voice low but unshakable. And page after page, you'll find names of black men and women who never stood a chance. Cases dismissed before they began. Sentences harsher than the crimes. Accusations without evidence. Convictions without truth. He flipped the book open, reading aloud a passage. His voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with controlled fury. Defendant refused the right to testify. Prosecutor declined to present further evidence. Verdict: guilty. That's it. No argument, no defense. Just a decision, written in ink and sealed with silence. Murmurs swelled in the gallery. People were leaning forward now, every word pulling them in. The judge's lips tightened. Mr. Halston, you are dangerously close to contempt. Richard snapped the ledger shut. Contempt? You think I'm afraid of contempt? This book is. Contempt. A century of it. My grandfather served this court, and I grew up believing it was sacred. But the truth is, it's been a stage for a rigged play. The black woman's pulse quickened. For the first time, she saw a crack in the judge's composure. Richard turned to the jury. You think you're here to decide one woman's case. But you're not. You're here to decide whether the next 100 years will look like the last 100. The air in the room felt electric now, thick with unspoken agreement from those who had seen the same patterns, lived the same injustices. The judge slammed his gavel once, but it sounded weaker than before. This is not history class, Mr. Halston. This is a court of law. Richard took a step closer to the bench. Then let's make it one worth remembering. The black woman smiled faintly, not because the battle was won, but because the war had just shifted in their favor, and somewhere deep in the judge's eyes, behind the rigidity, behind the robes, there was the briefest flicker of something. He couldn't hide not anger. Not power fear. The court was silent except for the slow ticking of the brass clock above the judge's bench. Its hands seemed louder than the shuffling of papers, louder than the cough from a clerk, louder than the very breath in the room. James stood tall beside Maya, one hand resting on the edge of the defense table. His knuckles were white. His other hand was resting almost lazily on his head. The judge, still leaning back in his chair with that familiar air of superiority, tapped his pen against the wooden surface. Mr. Fairchild, Judge Harlan said, voice dripping with condescension. You have exactly 2 minutes before I throw out this circus act you insist on calling a case. James' eyes narrowed. 2 minutes is all I'll need, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the public gallery. Maya's heart thudded in her chest, every beat louder than the last. She looked at James, trying to read his intentions, but he kept his gaze fixed on the man in the black robe. Then, without breaking eye contact, James slowly lifted both hands to his head and gripped the edge of his wig. The strands were perfectly groomed, the powdery white of an old English tradition. Maya's breath caught. She whispered urgently, James, what are you doing? Ending this charade, he replied under his breath. The judge's eyes flickered in irritation. "Counselor, if you think removing your wig will somehow—" James pulled it off. Gasps exploded across the courtroom. The powdered wig dangled from his hand for a second before he set it firmly on the table. Beneath it, his hair was not the chestnut brown everyone had assumed. It was a thick, coiled mane of black curls. Maya's eyes widened. It wasn't just the hair. His features, now unobscured by the wig's shadow, carried a subtle but undeniable truth. His skin, a warm bronze under the bright court lights, told its own story. James Fairchild, the so-called white savior lawyer, was biracial. The judge's pen stopped tapping. His jaw tightened. "What is the meaning of this stunt?" Judge Harlan demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier command. James stepped forward, each movement deliberate. "It's not a stunt, Your Honor. It's the truth. You're not just refusing to hear a black woman's case today. You're refusing to hear it from a lawyer who shares her blood." The air felt heavy, charged with something raw and uncontainable. Maya could hear people shifting in their seats, whispering, struggling to reconcile the revelation with everything. They thought they knew. The prosecutor tried to object, stumbling over his words. "Irrelevant, this is theatrics. Irrelevant?" James turned on him sharply. "Tell that to my client, who's been silenced because of the color of her skin. Tell it to me, knowing I've worn this disguise just to get a fair chance." In rooms like this, Maya felt her chest tighten. For months, she had been battling alone. Now James had stepped into the fire with her. No. He had torn away his armor and shown the court his bare self. The judge leaned forward, gripping the bench. His knuckles were pale, his authority cracking at the edges. "Mr. Fairchild, I will. Remind me of what, Your Honor?" James cut in, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "That you hold the gavel? That you can pound it until the sound drowns out the truth?" Well, not today. Someone in the gallery clapped once sharp, defiant before the bailiff barked for order. The clock ticked on. James glanced at Maya, his eyes steady. "This case isn't about me, but the truth is part of the evidence. And today, the court has to face it, whether it wants to or not." For the first time, Maya saw the judge hesitate. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was there, a fracture. In the marble wall he had built around himself, the wig sat on the table between them, a pale relic of a system that demanded conformity while punishing difference. Now stripped of it, James stood as he truly was, unapologetic, unafraid, and unwilling to play by the court's unspoken rules. Maya didn't know if they had just won or sealed their defeat. But she knew one thing. The story of this trial had just changed forever. The judge's gavel finally struck. The sound echoed, but for once, it did not carry the weight of finality. It sounded uncertain. The courtroom felt colder that morning, as if the very walls had absorbed the strain of the past days. Outside, protesters' chants seeped faintly. Through the thick wooden doors, a distant hum of justice demanding to be heard. Inside, every seat was filled, every gaze locked on the woman in the front row and the man beside her, the man who had shattered tradition with the removal of his wig. Judge Whitford sat in his seat, eyes on the file before him, but his mind elsewhere. The press had labeled him the Reluctant Gavel, a title that burned into his pride. He told himself he was here to dispense law, not to bow to public noise, yet his knuckles tightened on the bench. The case had stopped being just about law. The moment the lawyer's bare head appeared, and the world saw it. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, voice steady, "we've heard enough evidence to bury prejudice in this courtroom. But the real question is, will we?" The gallery stirred. People leaned forward, sensing the moment was shifting again. The lawyer walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical. He stopped beside the woman. My client has faced not only the weight of false charges but the invisible chains of doubt you can't see in a case file. Every word against her has been painted with the same brush, the wrong color. Judge Whitford shifted, eyes flicking. To the crowd. He hated that the lawyer's words lingered in the air like smoke, creeping into minds before he could stamp them out. The lawyer turned to the bench. You said this was about the facts. The facts are clear, and yet here we are, hesitating. Why? Because deep down, bias sits in the room like an uninvited guest. And unless you call it out, Your Honor, it will leave here with the same smirk it entered with. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The woman sat still, eyes fixed on the floor, fingers interlaced tightly in her lap. She could feel the lawyer's voice pulling at the walls around her, but she didn't dare believe in the outcome yet. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Counselor, you will address the evidence, not I am addressing. The evidence, the lawyer cut in, still respectful but unyielding. The evidence is that every credible testimony in this trial has been twisted to fit a narrative that keeps my client in chains. The evidence is that your courtroom has not been neutral. It has been a theater for prejudice. The air thickened. Even the clerks stopped moving. Cameras clicked faintly in the background, capturing every crease in the judge's face. Whitford leaned back, his robe rustling. For years he had ruled with quiet certainty, hiding behind the shield of procedure. But now, with hundreds of eyes and thousands more watching through screens, that shield felt like paper. The lawyer had cornered him, not with aggression, but with truth too sharp to deny. Minutes passed as if trapped in amber. Finally, the judge spoke, voice heavy, almost reluctant. I will take the matter under advisement and return with a decision. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was the first time in the trial that his voice lacked arrogance. The gavel struck once, and the room exhaled all at once. The lawyer placed a hand on his client's shoulder, not as a gesture of reassurance, but as a quiet promise. The woman looked up at him, eyes still unsure. We're not done, he whispered, but outside, the chants were louder now, and the weight of silence inside the courtroom felt like it was tipping, slowly, but inevitably, toward a reckoning. The courtroom was so silent, it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every eye was on Judge Whitmore. The man who had once leaned back in arrogance now gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles pale, his gaze fixed somewhere on the floor, anywhere but at the black woman standing tall before him. Aisha felt her heart pounding, not from fear anymore, but from an electric sense of control. She had come here as a plaintiff denied a voice. She now stood as the one person in the room whose voice could not be silenced. Beside her, Daniel adjusted his wig. No, his hair, since the theatrical reveal earlier had left it lying useless on the defense table. His golden curls framed a face that was alive with conviction. Aisha, he whispered, leaning close. You ready? She didn't look at him, but her lips curved slightly. I've been ready for years. The jury foreperson rose, there. Voice steady. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Aisha Brooks. Gasps scattered through the courtroom like a burst of wind. Cameras clicked, the sound rapid and relentless, catching every flicker of expression on every face. Judge Whitmore shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as if he might choke on the moment. Aisha closed her eyes for half a second. It wasn't the money she had fought for. It wasn't even the legal win. It was the validation, the public recognition, that what had been done to her was not just unfair, but unacceptable. Daniel took a small step forward. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying with razor precision, this verdict not only addresses my client's case, it calls into question the integrity of the court that nearly denied it a hearing at all. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing. In the gallery, murmurs began to rise, first among the journalists, then among the public. Phones were raised, live streams rolling, hashtags already being born. Every second of Whitmore's silence was a statement. In itself, Aisha turned to face the room. Her voice, though soft, cut through the murmurs. You can try to hide the truth, but it will find its way to light. And when it does, it changes everything. The words hung in the air, weighty and final. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. Come on, he said quietly. You've already won here. The rest will follow. As they stepped out of the courtroom, the bright afternoon sun hit their faces, almost blinding. Reporters swarmed forward, microphones and cameras thrust toward them, but Aisha raised a hand, not to block them, but to steady the moment. I'm not here to talk about victory, she said, meeting the lenses head on. I'm here to talk about change, and it starts now. In the distance, inside that echoing chamber, Judge Whitmore still sat frozen. He could feel the eyes of the legal community, the whispers among colleagues, the silent judgment of those who had watched his fall. His gavel lay untouched. For what good was a gavel when the authority behind it had cracked? Aisha walked down the courthouse steps without looking back. The sound of the verdict still rang in her ears, but louder. Then that was the quiet certainty in her own voice. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning of something bigger.